Nancy Guthrie. New expert questions. The ransom notes. What if the Nancy Guthrie ransom notes aren't what investigators originally thought they were? A new expert has now publicly questioned the authenticity of the messages and suggested an entirely different explanation for what may have happened inside Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home. But there is an important warning. This is a theory, not a confirmed breakthrough in the investigation. Here's what we know. The ransom notes. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home in Arizona on February 1st, 2026. Months later, authorities publicly released 2 ransom communications connected to the case. The first demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin and claimed Nancy was being held for ransom. The second communication was completely different. It claimed Nancy had died shortly after she was taken, allegedly from a heart-related event, and said she had been buried somewhere in nature. Those 2 messages immediately raised questions about who wrote them, and whether they were even genuine. Authorities have been investigating the communications, and after releasing them publicly, investigators reported a slight increase in tips. Now, a new expert is speaking. Forensic psychologist Dr. Kris Mohandie has examined the publicly reported details of the case, and his conclusion is striking. He says he sees a lot of things wrong with the ransom note theory. Mohandie questions several details in the communications, including the references to Nancy's smartwatch and a damaged floodlight. His argument is that those details may not necessarily prove the writer was someone who actually abducted Nancy. And then he raises another possibility. What if this wasn't originally a kidnapping for ransom at all? The burglary theory. Mohandie believes investigators should consider the possibility of a burglary that went wrong. His theory is that someone may have entered Nancy's home for another reason, and that the situation could have escalated. If that were true, the ransom communications could potentially have been created later to make the disappearance look like a kidnapping. Again, there is no public evidence establishing that this is what happened. It's an alternative theory being raised by an outside expert, and investigators have not publicly announced that Nancy's disappearance was a burglary gone wrong. But what about the writing? This is where your previous video becomes especially important. Other experts have approached the notes from completely different directions. Forensic linguists have examined the grammar, vocabulary, punctuation, and wording. Behavioral experts have looked at the tone and psychological characteristics, and ransom negotiators have examined the strategy behind the demands. One of the most interesting questions remains: why do the 2 communications feel so different? The first is focused on money. Bitcoin, deadlines, threats, and instructions. The second is focused on Nancy's supposed death, an explanation, an apology, and an attempt to tell the family what allegedly happened. Could that simply be one person changing their approach? Could it indicate different people? Or could the entire ransom narrative have been fabricated? At this point, we simply don't know. The smartwatch clue. One detail that continues to attract attention is the reference to Nancy's white smartwatch. The first communication reportedly mentioned that the watch was on the floor near the foot of her bed. That sounds like potentially specific information. But Mohandie questions whether this detail is actually proof that the writer was Nancy's abductor. Someone could potentially have learned information about the house through another source. So the question isn't simply, did the writer know about the watch? The bigger question is, how did the writer know? And that is something investigators would need to establish through evidence. Then there's the doorbell camera. There is another major piece of this investigation. Surveillance footage released by the FBI showed a masked and armed individual at Nancy's property, apparently tampering with the doorbell camera before her disappearance. That footage is one reason investigators have treated the disappearance as a serious criminal investigation. But the identity and ultimate purpose of that individual have not been publicly established. And this is where the burglary theory becomes something investigators would have to test against the physical and digital evidence. Was the person there to steal? Was Nancy specifically targeted? Was the individual connected to the ransom communications? Or was there another reason for being at the property? Those questions remain unanswered. The biggest question. Right now, we have several competing possibilities. Possibility 1. The ransom notes were genuine communications from the person or people responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Possibility 2. Someone else created the communications after the disappearance. Possibility 3. One person deliberately changed their writing style and tone between messages. Possibility 4. The ransom communications were an attempt to create a false narrative around what actually happened. And now Mohandie has added another possibility, a burglary that escalated into something far more serious. But none of these theories should be confused with a confirmed investigative conclusion. What we actually know. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home. Authorities have released surveillance evidence showing a masked individual at her property. Ransom communications were received and investigated. 2 of those communications were later publicly released. Investigators say the release generated a slight increase in tips, and experts continue to disagree about what the communications mean. But Nancy has not been found, and no person has been publicly established as responsible for her disappearance. That is the most important fact. Final. So, are the Nancy Guthrie ransom notes genuine? Could they have been written by someone involved in her disappearance? Could they have been created by someone trying to exploit the case? Or is there another explanation entirely? A new expert is now questioning the ransom note theory and suggesting investigators consider a burglary gone wrong scenario. But until investigators can connect the communications to physical, digital, or forensic evidence, it's still a theory. And that's what makes this case so difficult. The words may contain clues, the cameras may contain clues, the physical evidence may contain clues, but investigators still need to connect those pieces. And somewhere in that evidence may be the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie. If you want the latest verified developments in this case, subscribe to True Crime and Scams in South Africa. Real stories, real evidence, responsible reporting.